speaking about Shakespeare, which is
Yeah.
your favorite Shakespeare play? Why? If you had to
I
choose
mean,
one.
Which of my children do I love best?
If I made you choose one, just one. Okay, maybe two.
So whenever I go back to Macbeth, I am always astounded by how incredibly good it is. Somehow, when I don't read it for a while, it kind of dissolves in my head to, oh, that's the one with the witches and the ghosts and ooh, whatever. And then I reread it and it's incredible.
Esto es La Inquietud con Garret Edwards, el lugar donde hay más preguntas que certezas.
Damos vuelta de página aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario. Tenemos un enorme honor, placer y privilegio. Ella es la directora de Comunicaciones y Senior Fellow en Liberty Fund, una organización sin fines de lucro de las más importantes vinculadas con las ideas de la libertad en los Estados Unidos de América. También es la autora de un libro clásico que ya lleva más de 12 ediciones, Writing with a Thesis. Ha publicado una gran cantidad de artículos académicos que van desde Shakespeare al mundo de los zombies, a la falacia de las ventanas rotas, y sus artículos han aparecido en journals tales como Literatura Medicine, the George Herbert Journal, el Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. Se la lee a lo largo y a lo ancho del mundo. Y también es una poetisa, ha sido publicada en Standpoint, The New Criterion, The Vocabulary Review. Es graduada en Literatura Inglesa en Wesleyan University, tiene un máster y un doctorado en Literatura Inglesa también de la Universidad de Chicago. No es otra que SARAH SKWIRE, and I'm going to speak in English now and transition into English. Sarah, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Garret Edwards on the other side.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute delight and an honor to be with you today.
It is for us as well, Sarah. I'm going to start with an open question that I'm going to love the answer for sure. I also love Adam Smith. I have my books here with me. And you have
I have Smith right up there.
I'm sure you have them with you as well. Do we speak enough about Adam Smith currently?
In a certain sense, you can never say enough about Adam Smith. He wrote so well and so widely about so many subjects. His work covers, I mean, we all know Wealth of Nations, and we mostly know Theory of Moral Sentiments, but he wrote widely about jurisprudence. He wrote about literature. He wrote about art. He wrote about science. So no matter what you're interested in, there's always something of interest and of value from Smith on just about any subject. So you can almost not talk about him too often. That said, we're talking about Smith a whole lot more than we used to. The Liberty Fund editions of Adam Smith, I think, came out, I want to say between 35 and 40 years ago. I would have to check the dates and I don't want to pop off screen. But to have those editions available and affordable really caused something of a renaissance in Smith studies. And so it's a delight to have seen that happen over the years and to see the growth in Smith scholarship.
And they have traveled all across the world because I have the complete works here with me. And they are here in Argentina right now, and it's lovely to have them. As I was saying, Sarah, you have written about things that Smith would have thought or would have said, or what he would be thinking about different stuff that was not around back in his day. For example, I recall that you wrote, what would Adam Smith think about your iPhone, about our iPhones, about our cell phones? What would he think of them?
Well, it's an interesting question. I was playing around with a section in Smith's work where he talks about the human tendency to blow extra cash, spend extra money on trinkets of frivolous utility, on toys to play with. And he's thinking about particular 18th century examples of this: fancy decorated snuff boxes, the beginning of the sort of the rage for things like pocket watches, which had become far more accurate and more expensive and decorative in the period. little things called pocket globes, where you could have you'd have a little sort of hand-sized globe that you could literally hold the world in your hand, which was great for settling arguments at the coffee houses and so on. And Smith talks about the attractions of these little toys being about, not for their usefulness, but for sort of their charm and their distraction qualities. And that got me to thinking about the iPhone and whether it's a tool for us or whether it's a trinket and whether it's frivolous or whether it's serious. And I think Smith would have been intrigued by it because it is this intersection of a tool of actual real utility. I mean, I make my plane reservations on it. I keep my tickets on there. I do my banking and half of my shopping on my phone, right? But I also waste a heck of a lot of time with it as well. And we buy fancy cases for it and so on and so forth. So I think we know he would definitely have been interested. He certainly would have had one.
He would have had one. Yeah.
Oh, I think he absolutely would have had one. Yeah.
You also wrote, and I love this one as well because it's so left field and out of the box. Adam Smith goes to the movies, the Avengers. We have all seen the Marvel movies. And I never thought about crossing Smith with these superheroes, but they can be intersected, right?
I think so. Ian Scoble and I, Ian's a philosophy professor at Bridgewater State and a dear friend. So Ian Scoble and I looked at this question together, and we looked at Smith and superheroes in relation to his wonderful essay on the history of astronomy, which is not very widely read and should be much more widely read. And in it, Smith talks about these reactions to marvelous visions or events as wonder, surprise, and admiration. And each of those responses has different kinds of qualities to them. And so we sort of went through the Marvel universe and tried to divide the superheroes up into which ones would inspire wonder, which ones would inspire surprise, and which ones would inspire admiration.
Do you think Adam Smith would like Iron Man, for example?
I think he'd be very interested in Iron Man is such a great sort of economist superhero in so many ways, right? Because what does he say? He's a billionaire, philanthropist, genius, and playboy, or something like that. I'm getting the quotation wrong, but
the comics, yeah.
Right, the whole 9 yards, and he's entrepreneurial and he's an inventor, and so there's something very appealing about that kind of a superhero, more so than I don't know, someone like Spider-Man, of whom I have to be careful here because you're going to get phone calls, right? I love Spider-Man. I'm a big Spider-Man fan.
I love him too. I mean,
yeah, no shade.
New York street hero, so.
Yes, but a very different kind of hero than Iron Man, who's a hero mostly as a result of invention and entrepreneurship and creativity, right? He builds his own suit. He creates his own superpowers through technology and through innovation. And Spider-Man, whom I adore, gets bit by a radioactive spider and gets his powers through this semi-magical, semi-scientific, science fiction-y sort of a way, whereas Iron Man sort of works for it in that inventive way that Smith praises so highly at various points in Wealth of Nations.
This is really interesting, Sarah, because you just told us you think that Smith would be interested in iPhones and he'd be interested in having one of them, and then he'd probably decide whether it was a trinket or it was something useful. And he'd be going to the movies if he were around, right? He'd be using them as examples in his writings, you think?
I think so. He references theatrical pieces probably more often than any other kind of literature in his writings. He references Shakespeare and Racine and Voltaire's plays very, very frequently. And so was certainly a big fan of the theater of his day. So I think that there's no reason to expect that he wouldn't be a fan of movies and television, which, have taken over much of that space for entertainment for our day.
You mentioned Shakespeare. I'll get back to Smith because I have some questions about that, but you mentioned Shakespeare and I don't want to miss that opportunity. You know a lot about that. You've written a lot about that. For example, Shakespeare's Inner Economist. I'm a lawyer. I love The Merchant of Venice, for example.
Yes.
But what's your take on this inner economist? Shakespeare understood economics, right?
I think so. I mean, that's a very complicated question because first we have to define economics, right? Because obviously, when Shakespeare's writing, modern economics hasn't been invented. The language that people are using to talk about the things that 21st century economists talk about doesn't exist yet. Simply hasn't, for the most part, been invented yet. What I can confidently say about Shakespeare, though plenty of people disagree with me on this, is that he is more of a fan of the market and of trade than he's often given credit for being. People have a tendency to look at The Merchant of Venice, where Shylock is your great villain, right? Your great trader, your great money changer, and also the great villain of the piece. And even Antonio, the Merchant of Venice, is not the hero of the play and is not a happy person and doesn't have a good life. His life is one of suffering and of pain, right? In favor of in favor of supporting the happier relationships in the play. So it would be easy to look at just that play and think that Shakespeare is very much down on and very much opposed to business and markets and money lending and so on as just, writ large. But I think that ignores an awful lot of evidence from other places in Shakespeare's work. Particularly in the sonnets, where profit is used as a synonym for for a healthy sexual relationship and for the production of children, right? We'll get married and our profit will be these children that we will have, right? And in plays like The Comedy of Errors, where there's constant trade and exchange bubbling through the play and it's all going along peacefully and happily. So I think it's too easy to focus in on the one play, The Merchant of Venice, as a negative example and run with it. Same thing happens with Charles Dickens and Christmas Carol, right? People focus on that. They focus on that one very negative representation of business and neglect to think about all of the rest of, right. And don't think about all of the rest of Dickens's work. So
we're speaking about Shakespeare. Which is your favorite Shakespeare play? Why? If you had to choose one.
Which of my children do I love best?
If I made you choose one, just one. Okay, maybe two.
So whenever I go back to Macbeth, I am always astounded by how incredibly good it is. Somehow, when I don't read it for a while, it kind of dissolves in my head to, oh, that's the one with the witches and the ghosts and whatever. And then I reread it and it's incredible. My favorite of the comedies is As You Like It, because I've always wanted to be Rosalind when I grew up. And the play that has changed the most for me over the years is Lear, which I read for the first time when I was maybe, 18, and I just didn't understand it. And then I read it again when I was in graduate school, and I was starting to see my parents growing older and starting to see, how aging changes people. And it became a very different play for me. And now that I'm in my 50s and I have children who are teenagers, when I read it, it is again a very different play, and it keeps getting deeper and richer every time I go back to it. So I can't wait to read it when I'm 70 and 80 and 90 and see what it's like to read it then.
Those pieces that keep changing as we change, they are eternal, Sarah. Right. I'm going back to Smith because there's always this discussion on Adam Smith's views on education, and you also have your own take on women's education on Smith, which is really interesting. You wrote a piece, Nothing Useless, Absurd, or Fantastical, Adam Smith on Women's Education. What's that view that you have on Adam Smith's view on women's education?
So in his discussion of education, Adam Smith is criticizing the way that young boys, when he was writing, were commonly sent away from home to be at school. So they're sent away from their home as their families to be at what we would now call boarding school. He thinks it's very bad for the family dynamic. He doesn't think that the boys learn very much. In contrast to that, he says you have women's education where the girls are kept at home and they're taught in the family and they're not taught anything useless, absurd, or fantastical. The quarrel that I have here with Adam Smith is that I think that in searching for something to contrast with what he doesn't like about men's education, he doesn't pay attention to the many, many very obvious flaws of women's education in the period. Mary Wollstonecraft outlines these with extreme thoroughness in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and plenty of women prior to Wollstonecraft had discussed problems with women's education as well, and Smith ignores that or overlooks it or is simply unaware or uninterested in those writings because he's interested really in just talking about the value of being educated privately at home as opposed to being sent away to a school. And I think that sort of blinds him to some very obvious problems with women's education.
We can continue with Smith, or we could use any other thinker that you'd like to, Sarah. But you have written extensively about language, of course. And how important do you think language was for these 18th century authors? Were they really paying attention to how they were writing things and how things were going to be read, or do you think that they were just writing as things came out of their minds?
So one of my favorite things to do, because, you know, my background is in English literature and I hang out with a lot of economists, and I always like to remind them that Adam Smith got his start as a professor of rhetoric, giving lectures on language and on the proper use of rhetoric. We don't read his lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres very often. We only have them in the form of notes, the student notes from the lectures. So they're not, you know, it's hard to tell quite what to do with them.
We can all remember our own notes of our professors back then, so we can figure how they must be compared to the original. Right,
and we can all ask ourselves whether we would want our work to be judged based on the notes taken by students at our lectures. But that said, from the lecture notes that we do have, we know that Smith thought very carefully and very thoroughly about what language is doing and how to use it. He has some very specific preferences for clear language, for undecorated language. He's not a big fan of fancy metaphors, fancy similes, figurative language of any kind. He thinks it's excessive. He thinks it gets in the way of communicating your point and engaging your audience's sympathy. So we know that about them. We also know that his two great books, his two works that were published in his lifetime, went through numerous revisions. I think, I'm going to get the number wrong, but I think Theory of Moral Sentiments goes through something like 6 editions. You should take his language very seriously. When he says a thing in a particular way, it's because he's thought about it very, very hard.
Sarah, I mentioned this when I introduced you. You are one of the authors of Writing with a Thesis, which is an absolute success. It's on its 12th edition. How do you write with a thesis? I know we have to read the book, but...
So this is a work, this is a book that my father wrote when I was about 5 years old. As a college writing textbook, and he brought me on as a co-author once it became clear I was going to kind of go into the family business of English professoring, and so it's it's a beloved family project. The argument of the book is that all writing is really persuasive writing. In American schools, I'm not sure what it's like in Argentina, but in American schools, persuasive writing tends to be sort of like one separate unit. You have comparison contrast essays, you have descriptive essays,
Yeah,
you have
them,
and then you have,
yeah.
And then you have this other thing that's called the persuasive essay, as if all the other essays don't do anything to persuade. The argument of writing with a thesis is that any kind of writing that you're doing is seeking to persuade an audience of something, of the importance of Adam Smith's work, or the reliability of the language in Smith, or of Shakespeare's thinking about money, or of anything. It's all a matter of persuasion, whether or not you're using a comparison and contrast structure or a descriptive structure. So that's really the argument of the book, is that all writing should be approached that way.
Penultimate question, Sarah, you have a piece coming out soon in a collection with Alberto Mingardi, Show on Business, the Market Economy in Film and TV, and something about Firefly, the TV show, is that right?
That's right. So this book, which I think is coming out fairly soon, looks at the market economy in TV series and popular culture from 2000 to 2020. And Firefly just slid in under the wire. And so when I was asked to contribute something, I leapt right in and said, absolutely, but it's got to be on Firefly. And the argument of the chapter that I contributed is that Firefly can be seen as something of an extended discussion about what should and should not be allowed to be for sale. It's particularly interested in questions about food and medical supplies, so vital life supplies. It's interested in questions about the slave trade, and it's interested in questions about sex work.
Really
and whether those things are things that should legitimately be for sale or not. And there are constant points of debate throughout the series.
So it would tie to the idea of repugnant markets and repugnance.
Yes. And the characters engage in a lot of these trades and argue about engaging in a lot of these trades. And some of them, you often have competing forces engaged in these trade, where you have sort of a more moral version and a less moral version, and so it's a little laboratory for thinking about some of these questions, really.
The last question, Sarah, we ask all of the interviews that we have on this show. It's a pan in Spanish because the show it's called La Inquietud. In English, we just chose one of the possible versions. What makes SARAH SKWIRE restless?
Do you mean intellectually restless, or you can, spiritually restless?
I just throw the question and the answer is completely yours.
Okay. I think I'll give you two answers. Right now, I'm extremely excited about the new Netflix adaptation of Sandman.
Which this is going to date the interview, but I just watched the first episode before doing
Yes. Yeah, we're having this discussion the day that the series drops. I've loved this series since it was coming out in comic book form when I was in college. I just did a post for the Online Library of Liberty about the literary allusions in the series. One of the things that sort of gets me restless, gets me excited, makes me pay attention, is material that comes out that is just loaded with allusions and loaded with sort of a rich kind of a tapestry of literary and mythic allusions. And I think Marvel is exciting for this, and I think Sandman is even more exciting for this. And I just think that kind of storytelling is very cool right now. The other thing that I got all excited about today, because I get restless about something new every day. The other thing that I got really excited about today was that I got an advertisement in my mailbox for perfume. And the perfume advertised it. The perfume takes its name from the science fiction novel Dune. It's called The Spice Must Flow. But the description, yeah, back on your shelf. We should hang out more often, clearly.
Yeah, we should.
The description of the perfume is a praise for the old Silk Road and the spice traders traveling back and forth on the Silk Road. And I thought, well, this first of all makes the perfume sound really tempting, right? But second of all, isn't it nice to see such a positive representation of business and of entrepreneurship and of trade in something like a perfume advertisement? Isn't that a beautiful thing?
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your time and for your insights and for being here with us today.
Thank you. It has been an absolute pleasure.
La teníamos a Sarah Squire aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario.
Esto fue La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. Síguenos en redes sociales y en www.edwards.com.ar.